My name is Sister Maria. I am 33 years old, and 6 days ago, on January 20th, 2026, I died on the stone floor of our convent kitchen. Before I tell you what I saw, I have to be honest with you. For a long time, my life as a nun felt like I was just going through the motions. I wore the habit, I sang the psalms, and I followed the bells, but my heart was like a cold fireplace. I loved the idea of God, but I didn't know the person of Jesus. I felt like Christianity was just a long list of chores I had to complete to stay safe. I was performing for a God I was afraid to actually meet. I thought that by hiding behind these stone walls and keeping the rules perfectly, I was earning my way into his favor. I was a professional at being religious, but a stranger to being a child of God. I looked at the cross every day, yet I never felt the warmth of the man who hung there. I was more concerned with the starch in my veil than the state of my soul. That changed when the knife slipped. I was chopping onions for the noon meal, my mind wandering toward the stack of laundry waiting for me in the basement. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Sister Agnes humming a hymn in the pantry. The blade caught the slick skin of the onion and sliced deep into the palm of my hand, severing the pulse in a spray of heat. I watched the bright red liquid flow across the white onions, and for a moment, I just stared at it. It looked like a map of a river I didn't want to travel. I felt the heat leave my body in waves. I tried to reach for the counter to steady myself, but the world tilted and spun. My legs turned to water. I hit the floor, and the sharp, stinging smell of raw onions was the last thing I knew before the ceiling vanished into a roar of light. I didn't feel the transition. One moment I was gasping for air on cold tiles, and the next, I was standing in a place made of living gold. There was no sun, yet everything was filled with a light that felt like a physical weight on my skin. A weight of peace, not of pressure. I looked down and saw that I wasn't wearing my habit anymore. I was clothed in something that felt like woven light, and my skin glowed with a health I had never known on earth. And there he was. I expected a stern judge with a ledger of my sins, or a distant king on a throne of ice. But when I looked at Jesus, I felt like a child seeing her father for the first time after a long, dark night. He wasn't standing far off. He was right there, as close as my own breath. His eyes weren't just brown or blue. They were like deep wells of fire that saw every secret I had ever hidden, every doubt I had ever whispered, and every moment I had pretended to be holier than I was. I fell to my feet, weeping, finally understanding that my busy religious life had been a wall I built to keep him at a distance. I had used my vows as a shield to protect myself from the terrifying reality of his love. "Maria," he said. The sound of my name in his voice didn't just reach my ears. It resonated in the marrow of my bones. It broke the last of my pride. "The time for pretending is over." He didn't look at me with anger, but with a seriousness that made my soul tremble. He reached out his hand, a hand that bore the scar of a love I had only ever talked about, and the gold around us shifted. Suddenly, we were no longer in that heavenly space. We were hovering above the earth, watching the planet turn beneath us like a fragile glass marble. "Look at the calendar," he commanded. I saw a date written in the stars, glowing with a pulsing, urgent light. January 31st, 2026. "This is the start of the unraveling," he told me. "The world thinks it is waking up to a new year of progress, but it is walking into a threshing floor. They have spent decades building towers of pride, and now the wind is rising." He led me toward a kitchen that felt familiar yet strange. It was a simple place, with a wooden table that looked like it had seen 1,000 years of meals. On the table were 5 items, each one glowing with a soft, steady light. Jesus walked to the table and rested his hand on the first item. "Tell them to prepare," he said, "not as those who fear, but as those who obey. The physical is a shadow of the spiritual, Maria. If they will not listen to the simple things, how will they hear me when the storm roars?" He picked up a handful of rice. "Stock rice," he said. "Plain, white rice. It is the food of the low and the broken. It is the grain that feeds the world's poorest. I am calling my people back to a simple life. For too long, they have feasted on the delicacies of a world that hates me. They have filled their bellies with the riches of the earth and let their spirits starve. The days of excess are ending. I want them to have rice in their pantries as a sign that they have embraced humility. Only those who are content with the basics will have peace when the shelves are empty and the systems of man fail. Rice is the food of the servant, and I am looking for servants." He set the rice down and touched a bag of dried beans. "Stock beans," he continued. "They are hard, and they require time, water, and heat to become soft and nourishing. This is how I am working in my church right now. The hearts of my people have grown hard, like these dried seeds. They think they are ready, but they have no depth. They must be soaked in my word and tested by the fire of trials. Tell them that patience will be their greatest weapon. They want instant miracles and easy answers, but I am building a people who know how to wait on me. One bag of beans can feed a multitude if it is shared. I am preparing a community, not just individuals." Next, he picked up a glass jar of golden honey. It seemed to hold the sunlight of 1,000 summers inside its walls. "This is my eternal promise," Jesus said, his voice softening. "Honey never spoils. You can find it in the tombs of the ancients, and it is as sweet today as the day it was made. This represents my word. When the world's news is bitter and full of lies, when the screens go dark and the voices of the experts fail, my word will still be sweet. It is the only thing that does not have an expiration date. Tell them to stockpile honey, but more importantly, tell them to hide my promises in their hearts now. If they do not know the sweetness of my voice in the light, they will not find it in the darkness." Then he touched a small pile of salt. "Salt preserves what is good and stings what is infected," he said, his expression growing grave. "I am calling my people to be the salt again. They have become bland. They have tried so hard to be liked by the world that they have lost their flavor. They have forgotten that salt's job is to stop the rot. I am sending a shaking to the earth to reveal what is rotten. Tell them to stock salt as a reminder that they are called to preserve the truth, even when it causes a sting to those who love the dark. If the salt loses its saltiness, it is good for nothing but to be trampled." Finally, he held up a bottle of pure olive oil. He held it against the light of his own presence, and the liquid inside turned into a shimmering green and gold. "This is the most vital of all," he said. "This is the oil of my spirit. In the coming shaking, you cannot live off the faith of your parents. You cannot borrow the light of your pastor or your favorite speaker. You must have your own oil. You must spend time in the secret place with me, where the olives are pressed and the oil flows. The world is full of people with beautiful lamps, expensive churches, great programs, loud songs, but they have no oil. When the lights go out in February, only the lamps filled with the oil of intimacy will stay lit. The rest will be left in the dark, wondering why their lamps are cold." As he spoke, the kitchen faded, and we were standing in the middle of a city street. I knew it was January 31st, 2026, because I could see the date on a digital billboard that was flickering. The air felt charged, like the moments before a massive lightning strike. People were rushing past us, their faces tight with a stress they couldn't name. They were carrying bags of expensive clothes and holding cups of coffee that cost more than a gallon of rice. "Look at their hearts, Maria," Jesus said. I looked, and I saw that most of them were hollow. There was a gray void where their peace should have been. They were terrified of losing things they didn't even need. They were connected to the whole world through their phones, yet they were more alone than I ever was in my cell at the convent. I saw a man standing at an ATM, his hands shaking as the machine whirred. He was praying, but he wasn't praying to God. He was praying to the plastic card in his hand, begging the numbers to be enough to keep his world from falling apart. "They have built their houses on sand," Jesus said, "and the tide is coming in. The warning shot is not meant to destroy them, but to wake them. But many will choose the sleep of death rather than the pain of waking up." We moved through the walls of a nearby house. A family was sitting in the living room. The television was on, and a news anchor was speaking with a frantic tone about the economy and the rising tensions across the globe. The father was scrolling through his phone, his face red with anger at a political post. The mother was staring out the window, her eyes vacant, clutching a bottle of pills. The children were in the corner, lost in a digital world of noise and flashing lights. "They are surrounded by news, but they have no truth," Jesus said. "They are surrounded by people, but they have no love. This house is a fortress of fear. I knock at their door every day, but the sound of the world is too loud. They have no rice, no beans, no honey, no salt, and no oil. They have only their own shadows. Suddenly, the scene shifted again, and we were standing in the back of a large modern church. It looked like a concert hall. The stage was filled with smoke and moving lights. A man was standing behind a clear podium, speaking about vibrations and reaching your inner potential. He never mentioned the cross. He never mentioned repentance. He never mentioned the name of Jesus except as a footnote to a motivational speech. Jesus stood in the aisle, and for the first time, I saw a flash of holy fire in his eyes. "They have turned my Father's house into a marketplace of ego," he said. "They sell comfort to people who are headed for a cliff. They provide a rhythm for the dance of death. They use my name to build their own kingdoms. But when the shaking begins in February, these walls will be the first to crumble. They have replaced the oil of the Spirit with the grease of the world." We stood in the center of that grand church, and Jesus began to walk among the rows of seats. To anyone else, it would have looked like a thriving congregation, but as he moved, the people became like statues of glass, and I could see the inner workings of their minds. He stopped beside a young man who was singing at the top of his lungs, his eyes closed, his hands raised high. I thought surely this was a true believer. But as I looked into his heart, I saw it was filled with a thick black ink of self-worship. He wasn't singing to Jesus. He was imagining himself on that stage, imagining the crowd cheering for him. He was using the name of God to feed a hunger for his own glory. "He loves the feeling of the music, Maria, but he does not love me," Jesus said. "He is intoxicated by the atmosphere. But when the music stops and the lights go out, he will have nothing to hold on to. He has no oil. He is chasing a shadow of a shadow." We moved to the front row, where a wealthy couple sat. They were dressed in the finest clothes, and their faces were fixed in masks of perfect piety. But inside their chests, I saw gears made of cold metal, grinding together. They were calculating their taxes, thinking about the influence they had bought with their donations, and whispering to themselves about how much better they were than the people in the back rows. Their religion was a social ladder, a way to be seen as good without ever having to be holy. "They have bought their place in this building," Jesus said softly, "but they have no place in my kingdom. They think their wealth is a shield, but in February they will find that paper and gold cannot buy a single minute of peace. They have salt, but it has lost its sting. They use it only to season their own pride." Then Jesus turned his gaze toward the pastor. The man was charismatic, his voice smooth as silk, as he told the people that God wanted them to be rich, successful, and comfortable. But behind his eyes, I saw a ledger. He wasn't looking at souls. He was looking at numbers. He was afraid of the truth because the truth would drive away the crowds. He had carefully removed every mention of the cross, every call to pick up one's own burdens, every warning of the narrow gate. He was feeding the people sugar when they were dying for the bread of life. "He is a shepherd who has forgotten the sheep," Jesus said, and the sadness in his voice was like a physical weight. "He is building an empire of sand. When the first wave of the shaking hits on January 31st, 2026, he will be the first to flee. He has no honey, only the artificial sweetness of the world that rots the teeth of those who eat it." Suddenly, the church dissolved, and we were standing in the sterile white hallway of a massive hospital. The smell of bleach and sickness was overwhelming. It was a place of high technology and brilliant minds, but as we walked through the wards, I saw a heavy, oppressive fog clinging to the ceilings. It was a spiritual weight that seemed to pull the shoulders of the doctors down toward the floor. Jesus led me into an intensive care unit. A young woman was lying in a bed, surrounded by machines that hummed and clicked. Her family was gathered around her, but they weren't praying. They were staring at a monitor, watching the lines go up and down as if the screen was a god that held the power of life and death. They were paralyzed by a fear that had no bottom. "Look at their hands, Maria," Jesus said. I looked, and I saw that their hands were empty. They had no spiritual tools. They had lived their lives believing that if they just worked hard and followed the rules of science, they would be safe. Now, faced with the mystery of the end, they were like children lost in a forest. Jesus walked to the bedside and placed his hand on the young woman's forehead. For a brief second, The machine seemed to stop their frantic pulsing, and a light from his palm seeped into her. "The world has taught them to fear death because they do not know the life," he said. "They have replaced the oil of the spirit with the mechanics of the flesh." In February, when the warning shot is fired, the hospitals will be filled not just with the sick, but with those who have been driven mad by the realization that their bodies are not eternal. They have no honey to sweeten the transition, no salt to purify their souls. We moved through the hospital, and I saw a doctor sitting in a small break room, his head in his hands. He was a good man, a man who had dedicated his life to healing, but his spirit was dry. He felt like he was fighting a war with a wooden sword. He had seen so much suffering that he had closed his heart to protect himself. "He wants to help, but he is pouring from an empty cup," Jesus said. "He has no beans to share, no community of faith to hold him up. He is trying to be a savior, but there is only one savior. Tell them, Maria, that the healers must first be healed by me. They must stock the oil of my presence, or they will burn out like a candle in a hurricane." The hospital vanished, and we were suddenly standing on a street corner in Dallas. The sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the glass skyscrapers. It was a city of power and commerce, but the air felt thin and brittle. I saw the date again, January 31st, 2026. Something was changing. The digital screens that lined the streets began to flicker and glitch. I saw people stop in their tracks, looking at their phones with expressions of pure panic. "The systems are beginning to groan," Jesus said. "The world has built a web of light and sound that they think is reality, but it is a thin veil. In these streets, the 3 days of darkness will be felt most sharply. Those who have relied on the constant noise of the world will find the silence unbearable." I watched as a woman tried to pay for groceries at a small market, but her card was rejected. She tried again, her voice rising in a pitch of desperation. The man behind the counter shrugged, his face hardened by 1,000 similar interactions. Behind her, a line of people began to grumble, their patience worn thin by a world that was slowly grinding to a halt. "This is the beginning of the famine of the heart," Jesus explained. "It starts with a small frustration, a minor failure of the things they trust. But it will grow. By February, the shaking will be so violent that the streets will no longer be places of business, but places of mirrors, where every person will be forced to see their own reflection. If they do not have the rice of humility, they will turn to anger. If they do not have the beans of community, they will turn on their neighbors." Jesus walked to the middle of the intersection and raised his arms. For a moment, it was as if the traffic and the noise ceased to exist. "They think they are safe because they have locks on their doors and money in the bank," he said. "But the darkness I speak of does not care for locks. It is a spiritual heavy-walled night that enters through the cracks in the soul. Tell them to stock the 5 foods, Maria, because each one is a brick in the wall of their spiritual house. The rice for the foundation of humility, the beans for the walls of community, the honey for the windows of my word, the salt for the roof of preservation, and the oil for the lamp that must burn in the center of the home." He looked at me then, and the intensity of his gaze was like a fire that didn't burn but purified. "The warning shot of February 2026 is an act of mercy. I am allowing the world to tremble so that the people will look up. I am shaking the crutches they lean on so they will finally reach for my hand. But they must choose to reach. I will not force them to fill their lamps." We stood there as the city of Dallas seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic throb. I saw the shadows moving in the corners of the alleys, shadows that didn't belong to any physical object. They were waiting, hungry for the fear that was about to be unleashed. "The 3 days of darkness are the limit of my patience," Jesus said. "It is the moment when the door begins to close. The wise virgins are already gathering their oil. They are already soaking their beans and tasting the honey. They are already salting their lives with prayer, but the foolish are still laughing. They are still planning vacations for a summer that will look nothing like they imagine." I felt a wave of terror wash over me for the people I knew, for the sisters in my convent, for the families in the houses we passed. "Is there no other way, Lord?" I asked, my voice trembling. "There is always the way of the cross," he replied. But they have made the cross a piece of jewelry, not a way of life. They want the crown without the thorns. I am giving them the thorns now, so they might find the crown later. The scene in Dallas shifted, and suddenly we were standing in a residential neighborhood. It was a quiet street, the kind where everyone keeps their lawns perfectly trimmed and the windows are always sparkling. But as we walked, I saw that the houses were not made of brick and wood in the eyes of the Spirit. They were made of the intentions of the people inside. Some houses looked like they were built of dry straw, even though they were mansions. Others, small and weathered, looked like they were carved out of solid diamond. Jesus stopped in front of a house where the windows were dark, but a strange, flickering blue light from a television screen leaked through the curtains. They are watching the world burn on their screens, Maria, and they think that by knowing the news, they have control, he said. We moved through the wall into their living room. A man sat in a recliner, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of a news broadcast. He was surrounded by boxes of ammunition and expensive survival gear. He had stacks of canned goods and jugs of water piled high in the corner. "Look at his heart," Jesus whispered. I looked, and the man's heart was a knot of iron and ice. He wasn't preparing out of love for his family. He was preparing out of a deep, bitter hatred for his neighbors. He was ready to defend his food with his life, but he hadn't spoken a kind word to the widow across the street in 10 years. He had all the physical supplies, but his soul was a desert. He has the outward form of a builder, but he is building a tomb, Jesus said. He thinks he can survive the 3 days of darkness by locking his door and holding a weapon. But the darkness I am sending is a mirror. It will reveal that the enemy he fears is already inside his own chest. He has no rice, for he has no humility. He has no beans, for he has rejected community. He has no salt, for he has allowed his heart to rot with suspicion. Tell them, Maria, that you cannot hide from my presence behind a pile of gold or a wall of lead. We left that house and moved to a tiny apartment down the street. It was cramped and smelled of old paper and peppermint. An elderly woman was sitting at a small kitchen table. On the table were a few simple things: a small bowl of rice, a jar of honey, and a worn Bible. She was on her knees, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't praying for herself. She was whispering the names of the children in the neighborhood, asking for their protection. Her apartment didn't just have light, it was radiating a golden warmth that seemed to push back the very walls. She has very little of the world's goods, Jesus said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. But she is an architect of the Spirit. She has been stocking her oil for 80 years. When the warning shot of February 2026 sounds, she will not be shaken. She will be the one the others run to when their expensive systems fail. She has salted her life with sacrifice, and her honey is the only thing that will taste sweet when the world turns to gall. Jesus then took me to a place that looked like a deep, quiet chamber. It wasn't a physical room, but a state of being. This is the war room, he told me. Every believer must find this place within their own home. It is not about the size of the closet or the comfort of the chair. It is about the intent of the heart to meet me in the silence. Tell them that in the coming months, their ability to hear my voice will be the difference between life and death. The world will be full of noise, false prophets, panicked leaders, and the screams of those who have no hope. If they do not have a war room in their spirits, they will be swept away by the tide of fear. He showed me a vision of what would happen in February. I saw the power grids flicker and die in certain cities. I saw the internet go silent and the smart devices that people relied on become nothing more than cold pieces of glass and metal. The silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. I saw people running into the streets, crying out because they didn't know how to exist without the constant stream of information. The 3 days of darkness are coming to strip away the idols, Jesus said. People have made gods of their speed, their connections, and their knowledge. I will show them that without me, they are sitting in a void. But for those who have stocked the 5 foods, this time will be a sanctuary. The rice will remind them to be small. The beans will remind them to hold on to each other. The honey will be their light in the dark. The salt will keep them pure. And the oil The oil will be the fire that the darkness cannot put out. We stood together on a high mountain, looking out over the timeline of the year. I saw January 31st, 2026 as a sharp line in the sand. Before that date, there was a sense of uneasy normalcy. After that date, the world began to tilt. I saw the warning shot of February, a series of events that would make the global economy look like a house of cards in a windstorm. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was the end of the world as we knew it. "The door is closing, Maria," Jesus said, his voice sounding like the roll of distant thunder. "I am not a God who delights in judgment, but I am a God of truth. I cannot allow the lie to continue forever. The wise virgins are those who hear the creak of the door and run for the oil. The foolish are those who hear the sound and think it is just the wind." He turned to me and placed his hands on my shoulders. The heat from his touch was so intense I thought I would melt into the gold beneath my feet. "You must go back. You must tell them that February is the threshold. They have these few days in January to settle their debts with me, not their financial debts, but the debts of their hearts. Tell them to forgive. Tell them to repent of their pride. Tell them to stop playing church and start being the temple of my spirit." "But Lord," I cried out, "they will think I am crazy. They will say I am just a frightened woman who had a hallucination from the pain." "Let them think what they will," he replied. "Noah was a fool until the first drop of rain. Elijah was a madman until the fire fell. You are not responsible for their belief. You are only responsible for your obedience. Tell them to stock the rice, the beans, the honey, the salt, and the oil. Tell them these names because these are the keys to the ark I am building in the Spirit." The vision of the mountain began to dissolve into a swirl of white and gold. The last thing I saw was the face of Jesus, not smiling, but filled with a love so fierce it felt like a command. "Tell them I am coming for a people who are awake." His voice echoed through the fading light. Suddenly, the peace was gone. It was replaced by a crushing, agonizing weight. I felt the cold, hard tiles of the convent kitchen against my cheek. I felt the hot, pulsing throb of my hand and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. I gasped, a ragged, screaming sound that tore through my throat. "She's back! Maria, stay with us!" It was Sister Agnes. Her face was hovering over mine, blurred by tears. I could hear the sirens of an ambulance in the distance, a long, mournful wail that sounded like the world I had just seen. The paramedics arrived and pushed Agnes aside. They poked me with needles and barked questions about the year and the day. I wanted to tell them it was January 20th, but my tongue felt like a piece of lead. I wanted to tell them that the year 2026 was the year the world would change forever, but I could only moan in pain. They loaded me onto a stretcher and carried me out of the kitchen, past the half-chopped onions that were now soaked in my blood. I spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors spoke of blood loss and shock, but I knew I had been somewhere they couldn't map with their instruments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing dates. I saw the 5 foods on the table. I saw the empty hearts of the people in the megachurch. I was discharged and returned to the convent, but I am not the same woman who left. The Mother Superior told me I should stay in bed and rest, that the trauma had affected my mind. But I couldn't stay still. I went to the kitchen and I looked at the spot where I died. I cleaned the blood from the floor, and as I did, I prayed for every soul that would walk on those tiles. Today is January 26, 2026. I have spent the last few days breaking my internal silence. I have spoken to the sisters, even the ones who look at me with fear or mockery. I have told them about the rice for humility and the oil for the spirit. I have gone to our cellar and quietly begun to set aside what the Lord commanded. I am not doing it because I am afraid of starving. I am doing it because Jesus told me to, and His word is the only thing that is real to me now. The sisters think I have lost my mind, but I see the way they look at the news. I see the flicker of fear in their eyes when the headlines talk about the shaking that is starting to grip the nations. They feel it too, even if they won't admit it. The air is heavy. The warning shot of February is only days away. Thank you truly for remaining with us all the way to the conclusion of this testimony. If you're still watching, it means something in these words has stirred your heart. Now, we'd like to invite you to take a small gesture that can create a ripple far beyond what you imagine. Write a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We want to lift your nation up in prayer. If you haven't done so yet, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you never miss the messages and revelations we share each day. And above all, pass this video on to at least 3 people you care about: friends, relatives, or fellow believers. Because one simple act of sharing can touch a life, awaken hope, and guide a wandering heart back toward God.